Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you feel refreshed from your break and you're ready to sort of listen to and participate in this next session. What we'll be looking at in the next 40 minutes or so is a year in from the construction playbook. How has the industry implemented the policies? And probably more importantly, what has the impact been on clients and the industry in general? I'm Anne Bentley. I'll be chairing the session. I'm a Global Director of Ryder Levitt Bucknell, and I'm delighted to welcome my fellow panellists. Cubitt, Procurement and Supply Chain Director from HS2, Cliff Jones, Head of Construction Procurement at NHS Estates, and John Welsh, Deputy Director Construction at Crown Commercial Services. I'll just give all of our guests a minute or so to give a little bit of introduction to themselves, and then we'll jump into the panel discussion. So, and start with Andrew, Cliff, and then John.
Thanks, Anne. So I'm Andrew Cubitt. I'm the Procurement and Supply Chain Director at HS2. I've got a background both in engineering and the construction industry more generally, both the private and public sector. It's great to be here today because we're really looking forward to talk about the construction playbook, and I really believe in innovation in the construction industry and looking at what we might do in the future. So great to be here today. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Andrew. And Cliff?
Thanks, Anne. I'm Cliff Jones. I'm Head of Construction Procurement, NHS England and Improvement. We provide advice to other teams within construction procurement advice to other teams within NHS E&I and manage the P22 frameworks. Historically, we've developed and successfully delivered the P21 plus P21 frameworks, P20, and we will continue to improve and adopt new practices, and the playbook merely confirms what we live by, I suppose, historically. Thank
Great
you,
stuff. And John?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So I'm John Welsh, Deputy Director of Construction at Crown Commercial Service. So I lead 4 construction categories in Crown Commercial Service, and they spread right across our industry, whether that's professional services or products and consumables or off-site manufacturing or construction works and services. And as a business, we provide advice and guidance and obviously routes to market as well for our central government and wider public sector customers. A key part and role that we play is the advisory piece. So we've advised a lot on the construction playbook. Myself and a lot of my team were part of the drafting teams as well. Obviously resulted in a publication in December last year. So yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Okay, so to set the scene, and I'll ask this question to all of you, but I'll do it in the same order. So same question, but aimed at Andrew first, then Cliff, then John. If we could set the scene, so to what extent is your organisation already using the playbook, or perhaps more importantly, do you anticipate using it on future projects? So, is it sort of embedded, or is it still a bit, we're trying it out? So first of all, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So we were very fortunate at HS2 to have a massive pipeline of work in construction, and it's great to be part of all these new initiatives that come through. And we have a close working relationship with the Cabinet Office. So we were involved with the early drafting before it was actually published. And quite happily to say, actually, most of the points in the construction playbook we already had in our own internal processes. And some things that we've developed a bit further, though, in the year of its operation has been around some of the new areas like MMC, which we can talk about a bit later. But we've absolutely embedded and have been embedded in the early supplier engagement, which we really like in the construction playbook. So I really believe that getting the best out of the supply chain is really helping them to inform them about what our project's all about. And we do that prior to any procurement, and that's something really good to see in the playbook, because it's something we've always believed in.
Excellent. No, that's great to see. And so moving on to Cliff, again, how much are you using the playbook at the moment, and how much do you see it impacting on the way you do things going forwards?
Thank you, Alan. I think historically the principles of the playbook have probably been the basis of many of our frameworks predecessors anyway, and the current framework, and probably the future framework. However, we will enhance them where required. We're moving into other areas like modern methods of construction. One of the key, we've had the early contractor engagement for some years and have implemented that. We are trying to look to improve on the strategic collaboration we have with our supply chains and the wider supply chain, not just those at the top. It is central to what we've done, and we also, like the previous speaker, contributed to the development and drafting of the playbook and welcome its introduction.
That's excellent. And John, a slightly different perspective, I guess, because, at the end of the day, you are sort of managing and overseeing frameworks rather than actually being the client. So how does the scene pan out for you in terms of how the playbook is being taken up on those frameworks? And again, how do you see it being taken up in the future?
Yeah, it's a good point, and because you're right, at Crown Commercial we provide that platform for the departments to procure their projects and programs. So I guess from 3 years ago, I came into Crown Commercial, and at that point we were developing the strategy for our construction framework, and it was really key for me to embed a lot of what is being written now and drafted in the playbook into that strategy. So I guess we were a bit like Cliff and Andrew. Actually, we're slightly ahead of the curve in terms of the content of the playbook, based on experience, whether that was my own, whether that was my team's, or whether that was engaging with the industry at that time to develop a strategy. So, I was really pleased to be part of the playbook drafting teams, and trying to influence what went in there, because a lot of what I've experienced has been really good, but at the same time we can learn lots of lessons. My biggest challenge now is having the platforms available. I knew that was going to happen when the doorbell went. Apologies. So having the platforms ready now and available for departments to use, we've spread that across our professional services categories, and will do into our offsite manufacturing as well as we reinvent that strategy. But it's making sure that we can guide and advise the departments, whether CG or wider public sector, to take up the opportunity of embedding all of the policies that's in the playbook, because the facilitation is there through the use of the agreements that we've set up. So that's my challenge at the moment, but pleasingly we've got agreements within categories that help do that.
No, that's really good to hear that it is sort of genuinely moving forward, because there's always a concern when you're involved in any of these things that they're sort of academic exercises. So it's great to see that there is that genuine take up. Just sort of leading on from there, and again I'll do this question in the same order, but then I will go on to some individual questions. So obviously, the playbook is there. It builds on things that, to a very great extent, you were already doing, but obviously, gives it perhaps a different focus. But are there particular areas of the playbook that, as an organisation, you're prioritising? And obviously, the whole playbook is important, but are there some parts that perhaps need more attention or are more important to your organisation? So, again, Andrew, I'll address that to you first.
Yeah, that's a great question, Anne. And I think we're prioritising where we've got some passion, and I've got some real passion around innovation in this sector. So I really want to see the construction industry change in for the better, and it's really, in a project like HS2, we've got a great opportunity to help with that in some of those innovations. So there's quite a bit in the playbook about innovation, particularly around sustainability. There's also some commentary around low carbon, and personally, I feel that that's a great place to be. We should be, as an industry, focusing on that, how we produce low carbon solutions and transport, as well as low carbon materials. And I think that's where we're doing quite a lot of early engagement, and also we're doing a lot of work in how we become more productive as an organisation, hand in hand with our supply chain. So that's where I'm focusing.
No, and that's really encouraging to hear. Cliff, any areas of prioritisation for you that the playbook has really sort of brought to the fore?
Yeah, I suppose it kind of reaffirms some of our commitments to standardisation in terms of repeatable design, standard components. We're working with the Construction Innovation Hub in terms of standard grids. It doesn't necessarily mean volumetric offsite. It's a matter of fully understanding what modern method construction means, and that's on and offsite if productivity and efficiencies. We're also trying to look to address carbon and like everybody else, and social value, and we're trying to connect the decision making up in terms of modern method construction. Don't try and see these things in silos, because you might pick modern methods of construction, one method of modern construction, and that might give you a bad result in terms of the carbon footprint or even the social value aspect of a scheme. We were also trying to strengthen with CCS colleagues the EFS aspect of things. There've been one or two bad experiences in the NHS and probably other departments in recent years, like Carillion, and we're trying to safeguard against the risks in future.
No, that's an interesting area that obviously the playbook does, give some emphasis actually to that at the sort of very early stages of any procurement. And John, from again, you will have a slightly different take on it because you're sort of representing lots and lots of different people really. But are there areas of the playbook that either you want to see prioritized or you're recommending are prioritized, or indeed that you're really pleased to see in there?
So, I mean, firstly, I'd agree with both Andrew and Cliff there. They picked out some really good points. And to your point as well, Anne, I wouldn't necessarily suggest any one of the policies is kind of any more or less important than another in the playbook. However, for me, when I'm having conversations with different departments and suppliers as well, in fairness, there's a huge emphasis and desire to move towards longer term contracting. So these sort of portfolio type approaches, I think that's got to be a priority. I think that, amongst others, helps to underpin actually a lot of implementation of the other policies as well. So if we can procure in the right way effectively, using sort of collaborative type of forms or approaches on a longer term basis, then we're going to look to deliver the benefits around standardization, around offsite manufacturing, deliver the social value benefits across a program, and everything that Andrew and Cliff have just sort of touched upon as well, and hopefully within a huge advantage in supporting the financial stability of organisations and our sector as well. So the effective contracting and longer term portfolios are two that I'd definitely sort of suggest that there should be areas of focus on.
And just building on that, so coming back with a sort of follow-up question, are you actually seeing real evidence of that longer term? Sorry, not so much the longer term, but the sort of portfolio approach. Having perhaps a smaller number of suppliers over a longer period, or because certainly my take is that there's quite a big emphasis on that in the playbook, but it's not something that all clients feel that comfortable with.
No, they don't. But what we've got to try and do is influence and educate, because actually the longer term approach isn't new necessarily. So we consider utility industries, and I accept they're funded differently to some other departments, but they procure on a 5-10 year program. Sellafield have recently done it over the past few years on a 20-year portfolio as well. So these are examples that were in place before the consolidation of Playbook and the rest of the policies within there. But more recently, we've seen MOJ procure their 4 prism under a program. So as opposed to, as you'd typically expect, traditionally to buy 1 prism per procurement, they've combined those, which is really pleasing to see. And the benefits are already coming through from an alliance and a behavioural perspective, and involving sort of key supply chain tiers as well in that type of model, which is really important. We're already having conversations, and the approach or the intended approach within sort of the MOD on some particular programs is to look for longer term portfolio planning and procurement. And then I guess from a less infrastructure, more sort of building perspective, the government property agency have bought on a portfolio basis and approached the procurement in a kind of a term contract type of way. So consolidated the supply chain, but have longer term contracts where they can call off on suppliers that they become more familiar with over that term. So yeah, we are seeing this definitely.
That's really good to hear. And now a specific question, this one for Andrew. The Playbook has a whole section on outcomes and value. So I think the quote in there is that cost shouldn't be used as the primary sort of evaluation of value. In practice, are you seeing this sort of ethos being rolled out? And if it's not cost, how are you seeing other sort of aspects of value being incentivized?
Yeah, it's a difficult one for, I think, this industry. So I think the concept of value and outcome based approach is something you've seen in procurement of all sorts of other services, but in construction, because the profit margins are so low and the overheads can be quite high, it's quite a difficult point to put across. And actually, cost is important to the public sector when buying these massive construction works, but actually it is also about what you're getting for that, and that's where this outcome-based approach or value-based approach comes from. I think some of the challenges in the playbook are around how you set that specification, and it talks a little bit about how those specifications are not to be overly prescriptive and more outcome-based, and we are looking at ways, particularly some of the whole life costs of some of the assets we buy at HS2. Like the assets that you find in stations like lifts and escalators, how those are whole life cost basis, and how you might assess that on a basis which is more outcome based about how operation they will perform. So these are the types of things we're already thinking about in line with the construction playbook. I think it's a bit of a challenge for the industry to become more profitable, and also for procurers to think about how they're going to be a bit cognizant of that when they're making these things out to market.
And just a follow up to that, I mean, in terms of how, as an organisation, you look at value, do you take account things like social value, environmental impact, actually in that assessment of value, or do you sort of separate them out, if you like, and one is almost specification of cost and the other is sort of other things, if you like?
Yeah, it does depend actually on what's being bought, and social value is always part of and has always been part of HS2's evaluation matrix, and it's usually integrated in amongst the other parts of specification. And we find that that's probably the best way of doing it, really. So we don't try to set out the 10% to one side saying you need to have a social value aspect. We try to integrate it in our overall specification. And we'll give you some examples. Back to the lift and escalator example, we'll think about the energy use as being of the escalator itself. We might also think about the carbon content of concrete, and that would be part of it. And we also think about the labour mixes of installing and putting these things on site. So they're the types of things we tease out in our evaluation and also in our specification. And that's how we build in social value.
Excellent. No, that's really good to hear that they are an integrated thing, because that's one of my bugbears, that we almost try and assess things separately and then don't really know how they all fit together. What one directed at Cliff specifically, you mentioned standardisation as one of the things that you are moving forward, and obviously you've got, I would imagine, years of data from NHS estates and NHS improvement in terms of what has been built and what works. Are you actually seeing positive impacts on productivity? Are you actually seeing, if you like, money going further, or quality getting higher, or greater social value being included, or whatever your measure of productivity and value is? Are you actually, have you got a sort of evidence base to show that this is actually improving and that productivity is improving in the industry, or your section?
I think historically, yeah, thanks, Anne. I think we had what we called an efficiency and productivity program within the framework, where we collaborated with the wider supply chain, which includes the materials and components manufacturers, as well as the the contractors and subcontractors. And they were tasked with developing what's been called the P22 repeatable rooms. Now, if people were to adopt those, and they are quite widely adopted, you can achieve a saving of up to 5 to 10% just based on repeatability. You don't have to repeat the designs. It becomes easier to facilitate, etc. And they've been signed up to by the clinical bodies, etc. within the NHS, and they've got client support. We then moved on as part of that program to develop a standard components program associated with those repeatable rooms, and that delivers added value. You get longer warranties, free design reviews, the free maintenance periods for a period of time after longer than you would normally get, etc. They deliver real added value to the NHS. It's difficult to say whether it's about productivity or just added value, but they do deliver something. In terms of the overall program, you start to look at the KPIs and things like that. We do deliver high time and cost performance outcomes. We're quite successful on the published KPIs. Client satisfaction is well up into the 80-90%. So we must be meeting what the NHS wants. I'm not saying we deliver it everywhere. There are one or two projects, like every project, we have problems, but we go and fix them. Some of the knock-on effects out of the an example of one or two impacts of what are kind of consequential impacts of what we've developed are we had Axo Nobel and the flooring manufacturers, Ultra I think it was, worked together and developed a color palette tool on our website. That was used to, obviously for obvious reason, for color choice, but it's been moved into the clinical area now, where some people are now using it to train clinical staff and patients on the impact of color on people with the likes of dementia or Alzheimer's. You put the headset on and you can actually physically see it. I've done it myself. You can see that a black mat in front of a black floor or a black patch in the floor looks like a hole to somebody with dementia. So and we've got 3D modeling and things like that based on some of the information we've got. So it is improving the process and not just the construction process, the design process as well. And you could probably use some of these, I don't know, the 3D modeling certainly for training clinical staff in terms of moving, when the facility is being developed and putting the equipment in it. I don't know. I think there are big opportunities there.
They're really interesting points of how the sort of, construction morphs into the actual use of the facility and how it can be used, how we should be sharing information and data and training facilities, etc.
I think
Sorry,
the only final comment I'll make, Anne, is we have done we have done post-project evaluations of some of these projects, and the most memorable one is probably the Lilac ward at Scarborough Hospital, where they actually even put pedometers on the staff to actually measure how far the staff walked, and there was a lot less. Staff satisfaction was high, patient satisfaction was excellent. So we've actually gone back and said, well, how was it for you, sort of thing, in terms of the operational efficiency of it in delivering healthcare. So we've got the tools there. It's just a matter of making sure people use them all the time.
And I mean that is such a good point, and that sort of leads me on to a follow-up question for John, actually. The playbook's been out there a year now, and I mean, it feels like it was only yesterday when it was published, but it is almost a year. Are you actually seeing a direct link between the playbook and change in behaviours? And I would say both client behaviours, but also supply chain behaviours as well. And I wondered from, the sort of CCS point of view, if you're actually seeing different behaviours in clients or supply chain.
Yeah, that's a great question, Anne. And documents, policies like the playbook will be measured upon its success. For me, yes, we are, both at clients and at supply chain level. So clients, for example, when they, well, let me take a step back. Sorry. So in the implementation or the drafting, sorry, of the playbook initially, quite rightly, there was a blend of clients and supply chain members as part of all of those groups. So this was around stakeholder engagement, it was around influencing, and it was around ensuring that all voices were heard, such that the policies that actually came to fruition are right and can hopefully be achieved. So it was no surprise to clients and suppliers that the document was going to be published, because they played a part in what went in it. So pleasingly, from a client perspective, we saw very quickly departments developing integration plans or implementation plans. So how can they take from where they currently are or how they currently procure, to ensuring that they were adhering to the construction playbook, which was really pleasing. And not only that, they've taken up a lot of the training opportunities that the Cabinet Office team have put into place in the rollout of the playbook. So we can definitely see a shift change in attitude around wanting to do this, and wanting to implement the playbooks in the right way, definitely. From a supply chain perspective, again, just the interest that we had from the suppliers who wanted to become involved in this and did play a significant part was immense. I think for me, this is the first time government and supply chain have been as close. We've got a tremendous relationship now with the CLC. And what I mean by that is the discussions that happen are at the right level and on the right topics, but actually there's commitment from both sides as well. There's no kind of discussions that take place just for the sake of it. And I guess I'm not suggesting that happened in the past, but from my experience now, we see real tangible examples and evidence of how these discussions are moving forward, which is really key. And it doesn't just happen within Cabinet Office. You know, we've got BEIS and we've got the IPA on top of that as well, that play an active role in the rollout of the playbook. But for me, taking the supply chain that step further, it was only a couple of weeks ago I was having a conversation with one particular supplier who is currently drafting the supply chain policy, where the playbook's embedded, which is brilliant. So, and they're offering opportunity for their supply chain to be trained, so to get more familiar with the playbook. One of the key areas of implementation was for the users of the playbook, a client and sort of direct supply chain involvement level, was to ensure the policies flowed throughout their supply chains as well. Otherwise, this won't be as successful as we need it to be. So that's a really good positive step from supply chain that I've definitely seen. We've continued with the working groups, so the workshops that we have with the supply chain members, and we've got commitment from them in helping us develop and draft guidance notes and documents. So the next step for the playbook implementation is fleshing out areas and policies with guidance notes and practical steps to support clients and supply chain in its implementation. And the uptake and the attitude again from suppliers and clients alike has been really, really positive. I think, you know, the whole panel will know we're in an industry that isn't backwards in coming forwards. You know, we're all vocal at different tiers, which is what for me is making this a success. I think there's genuine respect from all parties that we're trying to do the right thing collectively here. We won't always get it right first time, but the beauty of working collaboratively together at different tiers means that we're still pushing in the same direction, which is a positive.
No, that's really good to hear. So yes, I think that sort of collaboration between, if you like, government and industry in actually pulling the playbook together has paid huge dividends in terms of its implementation. I've got a few questions from the audience now. So the first one is, it's not really a playbook question because it's what the playbook might happen in the playbook its next iteration, but I'll ask it anyway, and I already know Cliff's answer to this. So a question from the floor: do panel members agree with the CBI's view that the next iteration of the playbook should ban client and supply chain retentions? Now, Cliff has already said that actually many clients already don't hold retentions on their frameworks, and in fact they haven't done that for some years. So Andrew, I don't know what HS2's position is on retentions. I probably ought to, but I don't. So I'll ask you first, and then I'll come to John and Cliff afterwards.
Well, I guess retentions are a historic way of making sure that the substantial completions can actually formulated for the actual piece of work that's being delivered or construction being delivered. So and I guess Cliff's right to some extent, whereas quite a lot of the maybe old type of contracting allowed for retentions to be had, and we operate under an EC3, and actually quite a lot of the completion steps are throughout the course of the contract. So I think because we operate underneath that regime, it's less likely that we'd have a retention ability, and we certainly wouldn't retain sort of 5%, which ultimately you're going to pay for it at some point as the client. So we also recognise that. So I think, look, I'm not going to adjudicate whether the next iteration of the playbook should have retentions in as a ban or not. I'll let the CBI and the Cabinet Office deal with that one. But I think at HS2 we take quite a pragmatic view on how we commercially construct our contracts, and we also recognise the value of those retentions and how they add cost to the supply chain.
And it is really interesting that two of the sort of larger client organisations that have been sort of, leaders in the development of the playbook both take that pragmatic view on retentions. And perhaps the question is almost the wrong question, because it's sort of like the question probably more ought to be about what is the sort of state of mind of organisations that still rely very heavily on retentions compared to those organisations that don't. And I'll bring you in now, Cliff. I mean, as you've said, that you haven't used retentions as a sort of a major mechanism for some years. I mean, have you found that that's actually paid benefits to you by not having retentions?
I think it does. I think the focus should be on getting the project completed, on the quality aspects of the project and managing it throughout the project, to take the previous speaker's comments. The objective has to be to get it right first time. We can't have people, if we have defects in a hospital, we have particular issues with getting access afterwards once the hospital's operational, just like Network Rail would if trains were running on the track and everybody else. It disrupts everything. In worst cases, you have to have staff accompanied it if you're talking about a secure mental health unit or Rampton or somewhere like that. It's difficult to get in afterwards and correct any defects. So ideally, you get it right first time. You've always got to accept that pieces of plant and stuff like that might fail, but poor workmanship at the point of handover and completion. And I have to say, some of our clients do accept these projects on that basis, but I don't think they really account for the potential disruption afterwards. You'd be better off working with the contractor to get them right before you hand it over, and throughout the project, to be honest, because it starts from day one, to be honest, getting it right.
And I just think that's
and the only final comment is we kind of tie it in with a 2-year defects period. This is about confidence and trust in the supply chain to deliver. And if you don't pick the right supply chain and work with them, then you stand the risk of potential defects and the disruption afterwards, because it does disrupt the business. I don't care what anybody says.
And I think that's such a good answer, because it's not really about banning retention so much as actually developing trust and long-term relationships and reliability on the contractors that are delivering the work for you. And sometimes I think that there is almost a desire to sort of legislate for things, ban this, ban that, ban the other, rather than actually what I think the playbook is trying to do is encourage good practice all the time. And I would massively support that. A couple of other questions from the floor, and I'll start with John on this one, because again, you might have some direct experience on your framework at CCS. But does the material price inflation of the last 18 months or so threaten the playbook's aim to avoid lowball bidding, or at least make it harder to achieve? So, are you seeing in the sort of the frameworks that you're managing, issues coming through because of the inflation we've had over the last 18 months. And you know, I recall recession of sort of 2007 and 8, when a lot of good practice went out of the window and people just started bidding low. I wondered if you're seeing any repeat of that, or you know, anything about inflation really.
So thanks, Anne. So I guess firstly, I'm not seeing any sort of change in behaviours to bidding low. I think the current issue we have with material availability and therefore price impact is in live projects. So where you've got projects that have previously been bid and the price, or whether that's target cost or something different, it's the suppliers understandably trying to justify an increase in material costs based on a bid that was submitted or won 12 months ago, which is a really difficult situation to find themselves in. So I know the different departments are approaching things in maybe subtly different ways, but the attempt is trying to be pragmatic because the situation is real. I don't think anybody has a resolution to it necessarily, but it's, to your point there about collaboration, it's making sure the parties work together to find a solution that works for themselves and each other, because we are in a situation where materials prices are increasing because the availability is scarce. I think, you know, is it threatening the positive implementation of the playbook or its effectiveness? I don't think so, actually. I think it's driving the behaviours still in the right way, because there's a framework that sits around government and industry now, which is the playbook around how parties should be behaving. So it's giving suppliers a voice to come and speak to government about trying to achieve something in a collaborative way, because the behaviours and expectations are set within the playbook, and it's giving the clients an opportunity to flex where they can to procure in the best possible way to satisfy their requirements and outcomes, but at the same time leave a sustainable industry as well. So I'm thinking it's more of a positive aspect as opposed to you know, a negative one. If I think back to before the playbook, or actually when it was being drafted, we were in the midst of COVID, and we drafted supplier relief, procurement policy notes, and contractual behavioural notes as well, that both sit on gov.uk. Again, the attempt there was to work collaboratively with industry, recognising this situation that none of us had experienced before, really, you know, even pre-recession times, to work together in an attempt to try to resolve a problem that all parties are actually suffering from.
No, that's really good to hear, because it's always a fear that, you know, when the external circumstances change, then, you know, suddenly people's attitudes towards things like the playbook change at the same time. Just a final question from the floor, and then I'll do a little bit of a roundup question for everybody. And actually, I'll see if anybody jumps in and wants to take this. So the question is for quality-driven tender outcomes, which should include social value, does the panel agree? So that's quite a pointed question. Does the panel agree that quality component of a tender should be at least 70% of the overall award criteria? So I don't know if anybody has a strong view on that.
So I'll take it to start with.
Go on, thank you.
I was going to add. So look, I mean, it's a direct question, so it needs a direct answer, and the answer is no, I don't agree. So and that's going to be controversial, but I know where the question's going, and I do believe in getting value, and that's where the question is sort of balancing. It's about balancing the specification with the commercial part of that score. 70% is actually, by the way, what HSC usually goes for. So we usually go for about 70% on the side, and then maybe 30% on the commercial side. So that is a standard we tend to go for. But should we always go for that ratio? No, because there's going to be some things that you buy which require a different blend, and that blend might be for many reasons. and it might be, it's not the only way of doing it either way. So you actually sometimes you might have some gated thresholds that you go through for technical standard, which actually determines a higher technical standard. So there's lots of ways of cutting meat or the most economically advantageous tender. And I believe that you need flexibility in what you procure and how you procure it to get the best value for the public sector.
No, and to be honest, I think that's almost the only answer to that question, in truth, because you're never going to get a one size fits all, however much we might want it to. So
Can I
I'm
just
going
come
to
in,
sort
Anne,
of
on
do.
that one, if that's okay?
Oh, sorry, of course, yeah, no, please do.
Sorry, Anne, to jump across. Yeah, I completely agree with Andrew there. And the sort of the words I'd use, or the phrase I'd use, is the evaluation criteria needs to be relevant and proportionate to what the requirement is that's being procured. And again, that might sound a bit like a cop out, but the reality is there's processes that organisations will go through to determine what is the right evaluation criteria. I don't think we can be skewed or biased towards one or another because there's necessarily a policy around it. Of course, that's going to influence, but it needs to be relevant and proportionate to what the requirement is that's being procured.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that. Okay, so a sort of a bit of a look forward question, and this is, we'll see how time goes, but this I'll ask each one of you this, and again I'll start with Cliff actually, because have you learnt any key lessons in terms of implementing the playbook policies, and do you have any sort of recommendations as to where we should take this in the future as well? So, from a year in implementing the playbook, are there any key lessons that you've learned, and where should we go next?
I don't know about just the playbook, Anne, but I think it's more about where we go to build on what we've developed, what we've delivered to date and successfully achieved. We've engaged with our wider supply chain strategically as well as at a project level. We've gained a lot from that, and we intend to grow that, I think, in the future. We now work with standard component suppliers and manufacturers, as well as we do the top of the supply chain and those in between, designers, etc. They represent, they are represented on the future standard working group with NHS E&I for the NHS, etc. And they provide added value. We will look to expand what we would call the repeatable rooms program, standardization, whatever you like to call it, and we will work with our supply chains, and that's the wider supply chain, to improve on that. The biggest challenge, I suppose, is engaging with some of them, because they've never been engaged, they've never been asked the question, and it's trying to build that culture, down the supply chain and build the trust and confidence in them both ways. Because there are still people, I have to say, within our organisations that have a lack, do not necessarily have the same trust and confidence we have. So you've got to influence and persuade people that there's a different way to do stuff, just as you
And
do within the
actually,
supply chains.
I think that is probably one of the challenges in implementation. It's not just about how do we implement it sort of per se, but it's how do we engage with that wider audience. Andrew, have you learnt any key lessons, and do you have any sort of recommendations for the industry going forward?
I think my main lesson that I think the public sector needs to learn is listen to the supply chain and listen to our industry that we work with. And I say work with because it's a joint collaboration that we need to do to form these contracts and to develop out these massive schemes. So that's my main learning point. And going into the future, as I started, I'm a big innovator in low carbon. I think that's where the industry needs to focus. And I think together, with public sector and the private sector together, we'll crack that one. That'd be great.
Brilliant. And final word to John, again, lessons learned and sort of future recommendations.
Thanks, Anne. I think for me, it's now opportunity. I think there will be more lessons to learn as we try and implement requirements, outcomes, however we describe them, around achieving other policy areas like net zero, like the innovation piece that Andrew's just talked about, and Cliff did around standardisation, and I guess prioritising health and safety, as we always do as an industry, particularly around building safety now, as the legislation starts to to come into act. So it's for me, fantastic starting point. We're 12 months in. I think we'll continue to learn lessons as we work together in trying to achieve all of the intentions that sit in and around the playbook. Again, I guess, well, finally, the biggest one is communication. We've got to continue that open and honest communication.
Okay, I'd like to thank our 3 guests, Andrew, Cliff and John. That was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.